Willkommen in einem anderen aufregendes video. Oh, welcome to yet another exciting video. In this case, part 7 of my Napoleon War, a series of example games. In this case, covering the Battle of Jena-Auerstedt. Napoleon at War is a series of board games published by SPI back in the 1970s. This video uses a figure game version of those rules. Those interested in these rules can find the links at the end of the video or in the comments section to the rules. The Napoleon at War game system is so simple I will not be covering any rules mechanics in this video. Viewers should be able to pick up what is occurring easily even if they've never read the rules. I will also not be covering every nitty-gritty combat process in the game, as I did in some of my earlier videos. After a while, seeing units move forwards, spinning dice, moving backwards can get rather boring. I will cover in detail only the first few game turns and then we'll skip through the remaining game turns to the end so viewers can quickly see the progression of the game. After playing many games with this set of rules, which include also the original board game, which is fundamentally identical, I have determined the most important aspect for this type of game system is the scenario. Because the game system is so simple, the focus of each player becomes achieving the victory conditions in a given time frame. Each player will be under severe time pressure, not in terms of clock, but in terms of the number of game turns and how much you need to achieve in each game turn. With a simple game system, the victory conditions are critical. If given an unlimited number of game turns, the games will quickly become rather boring. It's this disorganised, rush and stressful play style which makes the game interesting even though the actual game system itself is rather simple. Another factor is the number of decisions a player needs to make. A game is interesting if a player has to make a decision, which will affect the result of a game. I'm uncertain if there is an upper limit to the number of decisions a player can handle in a game, but if there are too few meaningful decisions to be made, the game will bog down and become rather boring, no matter how many dice you may throw. In the past, I used to believe that what made a game interesting was movement on the playing area. If you viewed a playing area and then an hour later viewed it again, what difference do you see? If nothing has seemed to have moved, you may be dealing with a boring game system. If a lot has changed, then it's almost certainly an interesting game system. I do not believe this simple principle anymore. While it's absolutely true, a lot of movement on the playing area does make for an interesting game, it's not the movement itself which is interesting, it's the decisions players needed to make when moving. Any movement represents a decision point. Thus, it's the decision behind the movement which makes for the good game, not the movement itself. I now realise it's possible to have a good game system with very little movement on the playing area as long as players are making other decisions. In summary, it's the number of decisions which a player makes which has the effect on the game. This is the key factor on how good a set of rules are and how repeatable those rules are. After all, the more decisions you need to make, then if you play the game again, you may make different decisions and get a totally different game. The rules and scenario becomes highly repeatable. Let's now get to the game, starting with victory conditions. This scenario is based on the original board game, and while in this case I'll be using my own scenario, it was based on the original SPI scenario. This shows the board game playing area of the SPI board game. In the SPI board game, each battle was played on a separate playing area with an interconnect track in between. In this version, the whole campaign is shown on a single playing area, which gives players a better view of how each battle interacts with each other. The downside is the Prussians will rarely make the same mistake as they did historically, and the French will not have the first corps wandering around doing nothing as it did historically. This shows the deployment sheet for my scenario, which I'll be using for my game. The game lasts for one game day or 8 game turns, with each game turn representing 90 minutes. The first game turn will be fog, which reduces movement and makes artillery bombardment impossible. The French objectives are shown in the red circles here. Each objective is worth 12 victory points. In addition to this, the French player receives 1 victory point for each point of enemy element eliminated. The Prussian objectives are shown in the red circles here. Each objective is worth 12 victory points. In addition to this, the Prussian player receives 1 victory point for each point of enemy element eliminated. I'm not 100% certain if these scenario victory condition schedules are really that good, but I decided to start as simple as possible and then modify it later accordingly. We'll now move to the actual figure game, starting with the playing area, which you can see here. I've created a custom playing area using a ground scale of 1 in 16,000. This makes for a rather short game, and a larger playing area, possibly at least at 1 in 12,000 scale, would give you a longer game. But the playing area would be rather large, although still manageable. This playing area that you see is 6 feet wide by 3 feet deep, which allows both players to remain seated for the bulk of the game, which tends to be my objective these days. You'll notice the A and J represents Jena and Auerstedt. For this game, I'll be using movement trays, which have a frontage of 5 centimetres. If players do not use movement trays, the number of elements can be increased by 20%, or in simple terms, each infantry element, which is now 4 centimetres wide, would not represent 4,000 men, as in the movement tray version, but represents 3,200 men. Movement trays do introduce issues with advancing after combat. If it's a friendly game, which this game was, it speeds up play and works rather well. If it's a more competitive situation, as I expect my subsequent games will become, movement trays do not work very well, and I would use individual elements instead, either with the standard force mix or by increasing the force mix by 20% because of the scale change. Either will work. While the use of these 4 centimetre wide elements work well, the optimal method of converting a board game into a figure game format is to use square or near square elements. If using 6mm figures, this is possible with the use of 3 centimetre wide and deep bases. However, I do not possess any 6mm Napoleon figures, so I'll continue to use my trusty 15mm figures on a standard 4 centimetre wide base, either with or without movement trays, depending on my preference for the day. This shows a blow-up version of the Jena area with terrain and the initial forces deployed. The French are at the top, the Prussians at the bottom. The use of movement trays does make it a tight fit for the French. If you are not using movement trays, the French could field 5 elements and have more room in order to do so. On the other hand, the benefits of using movement trays is large. So, as I've indicated earlier, it's basically a player preference. This shows the position at Auerstedt. The French moves onto the playing area from the top of this screen. To make my images easier to understand, the location of Jena is indicated with a red circle with a J in it, and if it's Auerstedt, it will have an A in it. In this case, you can see the location of Auerstedt. Let's start the game. Game turn 1. During game turn 1, we have fog, which means movement is halved and there is no bombardment allowed. At Auerstedt, the French forces arrive from off the playing area on the left. In this case, they advance as far as possible as they need to get as much real estate as possible in order to perform or create a defence in depth. At Jena, the French rear corps move forward and no attacks are launched. If the French are feeling lucky, they would probably make one attack at 1-1, which is what occurred historically. However, if this failed, the French would be in serious trouble. The Prussians decide not to attack during this player turn. However, at Auerstedt, the Prussians do attack. During the Prussian turn, the Prussians launch an attack against the lead French unit and spin a 4. Attacker retreats. This is a good result for the French, as the retreat would be rather bad for them. We now move into game turn 2, which in this case is a clear game turn. The French finally decide to attack at Jena, and the French attack the Prussian position, as you can see here, and they conduct 3 separate attacks, as you can see also here. For the first attack, we have 3 against 2, and a 5 is spun, which is attacker result. This is a bad result for the French. During the second attack, 6 against 3, which is doubled as it's on a town, thus it's still 1-1. A 6 is spun, which is a attacker retreat, and the attacker suffers 1 loss, which is a very bad result. For the last attack, we have 3 against 3. The defenders are doubled, which means it's 1-2. A 2 is spun, which is a defender retreat. The attacker advances after combat, which is an unexpected result, but a good one. However, there were 2 bad attacks on the flanks, which is not very good for the French at this point in time. This shows the final French position at the end of their player turn. The Prussians have to counterattack in the centre during the Prussian player turn, but has the support of a lot of artillery in order to do this. At a 1-to-1 attack, they spin a 2 and force the French back. So far, not very good for the French attack. At Auerstedt, the Prussian move forward and launch 3 attacks. Going from left to right, the first attack is a soaking off attack using bombardment, as this unit is within the combat zone of control of a attacking Prussian unit. It gets a result of 1, which at 1 to 4 is an AR, which is basically no result because it's only bombardment. The Prussian could retreat if it wished to, but chooses not to. The centre attack is 3 versus 3 and 2 is spun, DR, good result for the Prussian. The final attack is a 5 versus 2 and a 1 is spun, which is DR, and defender loses 1 element, which is another very good result for the Prussian. This is very good luck and has probably doomed the French. This shows the position after the Prussians have advanced after combat. This puts the French in a very bad position because they do not have much depth to defend. Let's now move to a game turn 3, and there are reinforcements arriving during this game turn. The first player is the French, and this shows the position after the French movement phase at Auerstedt. The French have to try and push the Prussians back, if at all possible. This shows position after the French combat phase. The French left flank is being pushed back, but the right flank is holding, the opposite of what occurred in history. The luck was average in this case. The French launched 2 attack, they spun a 4 on one and a 1 on the other. So, pretty good a mix of luck in this particular case, but they're in a bad position to start off with, so I'm not sure if it's adequate. They need a lot of good luck in order to make up their previous bad luck. This shows the position at Jena. On the top left, you could see the French reinforcements arrive, in this case the first corps. This should have moved as quickly as possible towards Auerstedt, an error on the part of the French. In this case, the French player probably didn't really know where they wanted this formation to go. This shows the position after the French movement phase at Jena. This shows the French position after the French combat phase at Jena. The Prussian centre is holding, but the flanks are being forced back, the opposite of the previous turn. The spread of luck here is fairly reasonable, which is a good change compared to the second game turn for the French. We'll now move to the Prussian player turn. This shows the Auerstedt's position after the Prussian movement phase. During the combat phase, the French left continues to fall back, and the right continues to hold, which again is the opposite of history. Swinging over to Jena, this shows the position after the Prussian movement phase. This shows the position at Jena after the Prussian combat phase. The Prussian right continues to fall back, but the left is continuing to hold. Actually, the Prussian die rolls have been rather good, as you can see here, 3 and 2, so luck is still on the side of the Prussians. Something that I've noticed with this particular game, because the number of attacks are comparatively low, then a small streak of lucky die rolls will have a bigger impact, something that would not occur if you're spinning, let's say, 12 die rolls. We'll now move to game turn 4. Both players will need to make some rather difficult decisions, particularly the French player. This shows the position at Jena after the French movement phase. As you can see, a major issue the French have is getting their forces to bear on the Prussians. They've got a very small bottleneck to get a lot of forces through, and the Prussians continue to hold a fairly narrow front, which means the French superiority can't be brought to bear effectively. This shows position after the French combat phase. The French left flank continues to advance, but the right flank is now experiencing some rather bad luck. As you can see, they've spun a 6. Meanwhile, over at Auerstedt, the French are in serious trouble. This shows the position after the Prussian movement phase. The French have lost control of the road and are being pushed into a corner. This shows position after the Prussian combat phase. The French are continuing to be pushed towards the corner and potentially off the playing area, which means the Prussians will almost certainly achieve one of their 2 objectives. At this point, the French player has realised that it needs to send, or he needs to send, his first corps towards Auerstedt. And as you can see here, the first corps is beginning to move towards Auerstedt. As I indicated earlier, the French player should have pointed this corps in this direction when it first arrived on game turn 3. The problem is, as you can see here, is that there are rivers in between, and it would be easy for the Prussians to block them, but at least the Prussians would need to allocate elements in order to do so. We now move on to game turn 5. Starting with the Jena battle, this shows the position after the French movement phase. This shows position after the French combat phase. The French have had some moderately good luck. The Prussian right flank is in serious difficulty as a unit is in danger of being surrounded. But a bad move by the French unfortunately allowed it to escape, at least unfortunate for the French, very fortunate for me. Let's swing back to Auerstedt. This shows the French position after the French movement phase at Auerstedt. This shows position after the French combat phase. The French are on the playing area edge, ready to be forced back. Any further retreats will cause units to exit the playing area. Now, these units can come back after 2 game turns, but if the Prussians follow with an equivalent number of elements, 2/3 at least, then they'll never come back. And all the Prussians need to do is ensure that they can hold their objective point, which is that black built-up area square on the left near the top. This shows the end of game turn 5 at Auerstedt. One French unit has been forced off the playing area edge due to Prussian attacks. Swinging back to Jena, this shows the position at the end of game turn 5 at Jena. We're now moving on to game turn 6. We receive Prussian reinforcements, which, if they can hold the French back for 3 more game turns, will result in a Prussian victory. I'll skip to the end of the game turn. This is the situation at Jena. Unless the French can get some amazing good die rolls, it's unlikely they'll get their objective. The objective, you can see, is on the extreme right, which is the road, that's the grey line, that's crossing the stream. It's going to be rather difficult for the French to be able to get that spot now that the Prussian reinforcements have arrived. This is the end of the game turn at Auerstedt. The French First Corps has forced the Prussians to move some cavalry to hold the bridges, but as there are only 2 game turns left, the Prussians will be able to secure their objectives easily at the end of the game. The Prussians don't even bother to exit any elements off the edge to prevent the French reinforcements or the French forces that were forced back to come back on again. One good luck bit for the French is that the Prussians have spun some rather bad die rolls, so they've been unable to force any additional elements off the edge, but that's not really relevant. We ended the game at this point. The French have 2 VPs because they eliminated 2 Prussian elements, and the Prussians have 14 VPs because they also eliminated 2 French elements and also hold their single objective. The result is a Prussian victory. This is one of the rare games where I won. Mistakes were made and the French had bad luck at Jena at the start and the Prussians had very good luck at Auerstedt. However, even considering this, it would be very hard for the French to hold the Prussians back at Auerstedt. If the First Corps had made a beeline to Auerstedt as soon as it came on the playing area and the French had average or even good luck on game turn 1 and 2, then it may have been able to just hold out, but it would have been difficult. Makes me think the key moment may have been the death of Brunswick at Auerstedt. This probably doomed the Prussians in this campaign. At Jena, the French should have attacked on game turn 1, even if there was a risk of being pushed back. The flank attack down the French left should have been stronger. I feel the French should have been able to take their objective by game turn 8 with some better tactics and average luck. But there is no doubt it's harder for the French in this game. One tactic the French failed to undertake was the high odds attack tactic, which causes casualties and does have a cascade effect. On the other hand, there wasn't really much of a front line to allow the French to achieve this, and the French don't really have that much artillery in this particular scenario. One issue with a low unit count or element count is the increased impact of luck on the result of the game. If you only spin 3 dice in a single area, then the impact of a couple of lucky die rolls can be significant. It could be one reason why SPI decided on a lower scale by separating the 2 battles. Personally, I would find refighting Jena or Auerstedt a bit boring, as in each case one side has a significant advantage. If you build in the loss of leadership at Auerstedt, then the battle may be more interesting, at least for the French, but significantly less interesting for the Prussians. I suspect using 3 cm wide bases with 6mm figures may give you the better game. The number of units increase, and as a result the number of combats go up, reducing the impact of luck. I also feel it may be better if opposing elements actually touch each other, as occurs with the SPI Ancients pre-stag rules, but that would require writing a whole new set of rules, and I don't really have any interest in that, so I'll give that a miss. As the rules as they stand now work well if the scenario is suitable. The scenario works and gives a good game, but I suspect after a few games you'll quickly work out the correct strategy and can tell by game turn 2 who will win. But that would probably take a few games in order to achieve that. Players would need to ask themselves if the effort of creating this playing area is worthwhile if you're only going to get possibly 2 or 3 interesting games out of it. On the other hand, I must point out that I use this specific playing area for my ad hoc games. So while historical games will only have a limited lifespan, ad hoc games can be forever. This brings up a very interesting point. I really went down the historical campaign or game path, but I'm quickly coming to the conclusion that when you refight a historical game, you can only get a certain number of games out of it before you really come down with the optimum strategy and the games become boring. Ad hoc games, particularly using a card-based reinforcement and scenario system or some other randomized system, probably would give you more games out of a single playing area and single set of figures. Something to consider. For those interested, you can download the rules from the Kriegspiel.io group site, or can download the original SPI board game rules and create your own rules. Based on the playtesting, the rules are up to version 2.3, but the additional versions only consist of clarification of the existing rules and additional examples. So once again we come to an end of one of my videos, in this case part 7 of my Napoleon at War example game series, in this case covering Jena-Auerstedt. For those interested, this game took 2 hours to play 6 game turns. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.